Alright, so here's the lower intake. This guy is vacuum hose 24. It came off of the upper intake, went straight down below this, and goes into the back side of this vacuum valve here. This is coolant hose 6. Comes down off of the upper intake around the corner and also goes into this vacuum valve. Let's see, this one didn't get labeled, but it's a coolant hose. Comes onto the side of the vacuum valve and into this pipe that's got a couple connectors off of it. And then this little 90-degree guy also comes off of the pipe, and this goes right onto the back side of the timing cover. And this guy goes up into the bottom of that. And then we've got temperature sensor, vacuum switching valve, another temperature sensor, and another temperature sensor. This is coolant hose 6. It comes straight up off of the intake next to the thermostat housing. Does a funky 270-degree spiral and goes into the bottom of the upper intake. Alright, hopefully these will be easier to sort out, but this is fuel line number 1 coming off the back of the rail. That's the fuel pressure regulator, I believe, and that's the return line going back to the tank. And up front we've got fuel line 2, which is the main pressured line. It's the fuel damper, and this is coming from the fuel filter down below. Power steering pump. And the brackets on this are always the ones that trip me up. So here's a whole lot of footage of how this is. Pump sits down there, sort of in this cradle. 3 bolts into the head. On the back side, got a couple more. I don't know if it's light enough to tell, but there's one here, and then there's one here, and the one down here goes through this bracket, and that's the one that always really messes with me. So here's the lower power steering pump bracket, and it's tough to see, but it bolts in to this guy right down here, about equidistance between the water pump and the oil pump. EC18 is another square style with this snap ring. It goes on the back side. It's quite terrible, I can barely see it, let alone touch it. Down in between the middle of the lower intake onto the back side of Okay, EC17 and EC16 were both running down through the lower intake, and they connect to the other end of a wiring harness that is hiding down here. So there's 2 plugs that are used. However, on EC17 it's got this sort of dual plug thing. I would imagine the unused port is for an automatic transmission of some sort. EC15 looks like this, maybe. And on your truck it probably goes to the starter. EC14, same story as before. I pulled it up for better visibility, but it was going down through this hole in the lower intake, and EC14 goes to the oil pressure sender. oil pressure sender below the oil filter. EC13 came up from, or sorry, I pulled it up through this, but it was down. It goes to the knock sensor on the side of the block. And here we have EC12, which goes to this guy, which goes to the coil and igniter. This guy has a long run. It goes all the way around, across the firewall, across the valve cover, and then into this mid-intake harness. Alright, so injector wires are all off. Got them labeled IJ1, IJ2, IJ3, and IJ4. Those are all loose. But more importantly, under the upper intake we have this bonus, I'm calling it EC11. It goes down to what appears to be yet another coolant temperature sender. Vacuum hose 24 is this big guy. It goes down into the depths somewhere, but it goes into this huge port on the lower side of the intake. Okay, EC9 was almost impossible to see, but it is a ground connector, and it was going to this lower bolt on the rear of the upper intake. EC10 is the connector for the cold start injector right here. Okay, next up we got EC7. It'll focus there. Is a large ground wire going to this port on the intake. EC8 down there in the hole is doing the same thing. And then this guy, a little hard to see, but it's coolant hose 6, and it is coming straight off the bottom of the intake. Alright, so VH21 goes to this port on the EGR valve and to the rearmost connector on the communal vacuum rail. VH22 comes off the second to last and goes up to the rear port on this guy, which I'm not 100% sure what it is. And then we're going to say VH23 is a larger one, comes off the bottom of this guy and goes around to the back to that port. Alright, so VH17 is coming off of this, hard to see, it's getting dark, 3-way port on the back of the intake, and it goes all the way over to the cruise control diaphragm. VH18 is coming off of this common rail. It's the forward of these two, and it's going to the driver's side port on this little valve. VH19 is coming off of the rear of these two, and it's going to the passenger side. And then VH20 is going to be the PCV hose. Obviously going from the PCV valve over to the lower port below this other large port on the intake. Alright, finally back to VH1. I got enough stuff off to find out that it goes all the way around the back underneath and goes over here to the charcoal canister to the small port. Alright, EC5, which I've labeled both sides of because this is going to go in the parts pile, is the loose vacuum switching valve. EC6 is going to be the one that was actually mounted to something. Alright, VH14 is a vacuum hose going off of the intake. It's a big port near the back, and it goes up to this little junction with a one-way valve on its way over to the brake booster. VH15 is going in the back side of this janky vacuum switching valve, which is just rattling around on my intake. It goes to the back of the intake through this into this little three-way clip, and then goes around and ties into this port in the back corner. And then VH16 comes off the front side of the switching valve, and it goes to one of the ports on this three-way manifold. And we have coolant hose 5, which is already out of place, but it went from the heater valve down to this guy coming out of the back side of the engine. Changing gears again. Most of you aren't going to have this, but this is coolant hose number 1. It's coming off the front of my heat exchanger for my onboard shower. And it goes up and around, down, and goes into a T that originally fed the rear heater, which I have removed. Coolant hose 2 comes off the back of the heat exchanger, and it goes into the bottom of the heater valve. Coolant hose 3 comes out of the driver's side of the heater core and goes into the side of the heater valve, and coolant hose 4 comes out of the passenger side of the heater core and goes back down to that T. Back to vacuum hoses, VH12. Maybe not technically a vacuum hose, but I'm not going to split hairs. Comes off the bottom of the intake here and goes down to this valve. I believe it's coolant running through the valve, so temperature related. And VH13 is this shorty, and it's just a breather, a one-way breather coming off the dash pot on the throttle. And since we're in the middle of it, EC4 is going to be this other temperature sender. Alright, switching gears for a second. We're on electrical connector 1. So EC1 is going to the throttle position sensor. EC2 is going to this coolant temperature switch or sensor, and EC3 is going to this other coolant temperature switch or sensor. VH9 is this big vent, goes off of the open port on the valve cover to this large port below the that valve guy. VH10 comes off the front port of this vacuum switching valve and goes to a little elbow port on the bottom of the valve. And VH11 comes off the back side of that vacuum switching valve, and it goes around to the back side elbow on this valve. So VH7 comes off of this large port in front of the valve, and it goes to the driver's side connector down here on the power steering pump. But I might be putting a new pump in, and if I do, whatever that vacuum port is may get turned around, so I put a big scratch mark next to it. So VH7 gets the scratch mark. VH8 comes off of this valve, and it goes to the other port on the power steering pump. So VH5 and VH6 are these parallel U-shaped ones. You go from this little vacuum switching valve around to the two rails. So VH3 goes to the first port here, VH2 goes to the second port, VH4 is a little bit fatter, goes to this spring-loaded valve or something on the side of the intake. Alright, we have the first of many vacuum hoses labeled. I decided vacuum hose 1, 2, 3, and 4 made sense. Of course, that means the first one said VH1, so that's a little funny.